Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Easton, president of the Claire Booth Luce Policy Institute, and I want to welcome you to our July Conservative Women's Network. Special thank you to Bridget Wagner, our partner in these from the Heritage Foundation for nearly 20 years. We had a wonderful reception last week up on the roof to celebrate almost 20 years of Conservative Women's Network, and we've been running some photos from that as well as some other CWN slides here on the screens as you enter. But I wanted to say thank you again to Bridget and the Heritage Foundation for a wonderful reception. What a gorgeous facility they have there up on the roof, and it was just the most beautiful evening. Thank you so much. Today I'm pleased to introduce our July CWN speaker, Joyce Lee Malcolm. I should have known of you, Joyce, but honestly, I didn't know of your work until I was reading National Review magazine a couple of months ago, and it was an article with this photo titled, "The Nice Girl Who Saved the Second Amendment." I confess it was the photo that pulled me in. She's making this luxurious gesture here. But it was an article that explained how her writings and her scholarship helped make it possible for the Supreme Court's Heller decision, which recognized an individual's right to possess a firearm. And I think this is our 10th anniversary of Heller this year. Her work was cited several times in the decision, which was called District of Columbia versus Heller. In the National Review article, Joyce is quoted as saying, "People used to say, 'How did a nice girl like you get into a subject like this?' But she said, 'I'm not asked that anymore. Maybe they don't think I'm a nice girl.'" Of course you are. She's the Patrick Henry Professor of Constitutional Law and the Second Amendment at Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. She's a historian and a constitutional scholar active in the area of constitutional history, focusing on the development of individual rights in Great Britain and America. And she told me her favorite course that she teaches is called War and Law. Wouldn't that be a great course to take? She's written many books and articles on gun control, on the Second Amendment, and individual rights. And here's one book that I'm reading called To Keep and Bear Arms, The Origins of an Anglo-American Right. I recommend this to you all. She previously taught at Princeton University, at Bentley College, at Boston University, at Northeastern University, and Cambridge University. Also was a senior advisor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Security Studies Program, a visiting scholar at Massachusetts Center for Renaissance Studies, and is a bi-fellow at Robinson College, Cambridge University. Then, a couple of weeks ago, I knew you were coming, and I was reading the Wall Street Journal on the weekend. They have this neat little section where an expert on a subject recommends their favorite books on it. So here it was. The 5 best books on treason by Joyce Lee Malcolm. And it said she was the author of the most recent book, The Tragedy of Benedict Arnold. So I ordered it. And what a fabulous book. I can only recommend this very, very highly to you. I knew that Benedict Arnold was a traitor, but that's all I knew. And reading the story of his life and getting a deeper understanding of all that was going on in the country during his life, it's truly fascinating. So it's not her topic today, but I want to recommend it to you as a really good read about early America and a great patriot, how he betrayed his country and went to the dark side. She's written many essays in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, USA Today, the Boston Globe, and many other newspapers. Joyce has 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. It's a writing family. One of her sons won the Pulitzer Prize for his writing for a Wisconsin newspaper. In her spare time, she likes to walk her dog, she likes to travel, and she loves rare books. Today, she's going to talk to us about women and self-defense, the right to be armed. Please join me in welcoming Joyce Lee Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for inviting me to come here. That nice girl saying, there are 2 reasons, apart from the fact that they might not think I'm nice anymore, why I think that no one is asking. And that is because I think that for one reason that maybe the subject is okay now. And I'd love to think that it isn't an unpleasant subject. And the other is that it should be of a particular interest to women, because for women, being able to protect yourself is really, really important. And while you can have a right to self-defense, if you don't have a right to some implement to help you with that defense, it is pretty meaningless. Anyway, I'm looking forward to speaking to you, and I will just go kind of quickly through this, but I'd be happy to answer any questions if your stomachs can hold it. First, the right to be armed is, self-defense is the primary law of nature, and it's Blackstone, who is sort of the leading jurist, the British jurist on individual rights, and who wrote a book on commentaries on the laws of England just at the time of our revolution, said that self-defense, as it is justly called the primary law of nature, so it is not, neither can it be in fact taken away by the law of society. The law respects the passions of the human mind and makes it lawful in him to do himself that immediate justice to which he is prompted by nature, and which no prudential motives are strong enough to restrain. It considers the future process of law by no means an adequate remedy for injuries accompanied by force. I was writing on this subject back in the 80s, and when it was, one of my friends, Randy Barnett at Georgetown, said was not a cool subject, obviously. In 2002, a man named Amitai Etzioni, who is a commutarian, wrote an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education called Are Liberal Scholars Acting Irresponsibly on Gun Control? And I'm the only one he mentioned by name. He said that if you actually did the work and found that the right to be armed in the Second Amendment was an individual right, as opposed to just a right for people in the militia to have guns within the militia. You found it was an individual right. You actually had a right and a responsibility to keep that information to yourself. And he compared, pointing out that the Second Amendment was an individual right, to a web demonstration of how to make Ebola virus in your kitchen sink. The whole thing was so preposterous that I did not respond. But there was this very strong, and has been, it continues to be, a sense that there really isn't an individual right. It's only a collective right for everybody, but not an individual right for any one person. The people who claim that feel that you don't any longer need an individual right to be armed because the government will protect you. And I add, oops, this is all wrong here. It's backwards. Can I try that? Okay, here we go. I'm going in the wrong direction. Sorry about that. How did a nice girl like you get interested in a subject like this? There's a cartoon, and I'm not sure that you can read it. And it says, "This house protected by a Second Amendment scholar," which I love. And here's Blackstone's comment about the self-defense, justly called the primary law of nature. It really is something sort of inherent in us. Some people say that there's this sort of religious sense that you were created in God's image, and therefore you should be able to protect yourself. And also, of course, there's a requirement and a sense that you want to protect your family and your loved ones and your neighbors. And the law is not going to be there in time to help you in your moment of need. Will the government protect you, and can it? And I'd just like to draw your attention to a particular case also from the District of Columbia called Warren versus the District of Columbia, 1981. In this case, there were 3 women who were sharing a townhouse on Capitol Hill. 2 men broke in downstairs, and there was one of the women was downstairs, the other 2 were upstairs. And the 2 upstairs heard her screaming, and they called 911. They continued to call 911 for more than half an hour. Nobody ever came. When the screaming stopped, they thought that maybe someone had come, or that whoever was attacking her had left. So they went downstairs, and the 2 men who were attacking her were still there. and they proceeded for the next 14 hours to abuse these 3 women. I shouldn't say no one ever came. There was a police car apparently that drove by the house but never bothered to come in to see if anything was happening. So these women sued the District of Columbia and the police department because they were not being protected. The response of the judge in this case was, as you can see at the bottom here, the duty to provide public service is owed to the public at large, everyone, but absent a special relationship, whatever that is, between the police and an individual, no specific legal duty exists. In other words, everybody is entitled to protection, but no one person is entitled to protection. And so these women lost their case. And apparently, according to the judge, this was sort of the traditional government view about government servants, that they cannot be sued for not protecting an individual citizen. There are a lot of issues about how women can protect themselves, and particularly for battered women, people who get restraining orders. And some 4,000 women a year die at the hands of their abusers. Restraining orders are not that much help because the police are not always there when somebody is about to come, and the women are usually unarmed. And I should say, and I don't want to take too much extra time, but a couple of years ago there was a hearing in the Senate on defense against violence. I'm forgetting the exact name. Yes, the Violence Against Women's Act. Thank you. And they called me up, the committee, to ask if I would come and talk because the problem was that the change to that law was going to allow the police to simply take away any weapons that the man had without any notice, and afterwards he could claim to get them back. So I was really there to talk about due process, that if before somebody takes something from you, you should have a right to make a statement. And I went to the room we were supposed to be at, and apparently there were so many people they had moved to a larger room. And here was this huge crowd of women from SAVE and other organizations who were very intent on women not being armed, but being able to get this, whoever might be threatening them, disarmed. And they all sat behind me as I testified, which is was a kind of unnerving situation. But when one of them, a couple, mentioned the fact that women had restraining orders and yet something bad happened to them, and it was my turn to talk, I said, well, if they had been armed, maybe they would have been prepared and could have protected themselves. At any rate, there's also the Brady Campaign, which used to be handgun control. And their view is that you don't need a gun because probably it'd be taken from you and you would be worse off if you had it. And as Pete Shields said, and you can see on that slide, that that actually you're much more likely to put up no defense, you'll be better off. If you put up a defense, you'll be severely injured. So basically they're telling women, don't need to do anything. You're safer if you just sit there or lie there. The Guardian newspaper in Britain had a charity caring for rape victims warn yesterday in their article that sometimes it's far better just let it happen and then deal with the aftermath. They were annoyed at a study that was published in Cosmopolitan magazine that showed that that women who fought back were much less likely to be injured, or at least could possibly escape. At any rate, there are more than 2 million defensive uses of a gun in this country every year. It's hard to get the numbers because most people who use a gun in self-defense do not report it to the police. The people who want to say that you're going to hurt yourself or it's almost unusual to have a gun help anybody only count a defensive use if you actually kill the person who's attacking you. Chase him away, shoot him, and not kill him, they don't count that. And the police don't count defensive uses either. So there's it's hard for people to actually get the number unless you have some kind of anonymous survey, but there are extraordinary numbers. And most of the time, you just have to actually show the gun. You don't need to do anything with it, and people will back off. In any event, the District of Columbia versus Heller is the Supreme Court case in 2008, which is this first decade of it, celebrating this year, in which the Supreme Court actually found that there was an individual right to have weapons, and as they put it, those weapons in common use for self-defense and other lawful purposes. So you can have a handgun in your home. This case was important because it was the first time that the Supreme Court actually was very specific that this was an individual right and not just a collective right, like the right to be protected by the police, where it protects everybody, but it doesn't really protect any one person. And I'd just like to tell you what this law was. Some of you may know it. If you live in the district, that went into effect in 1976, and it was in effect for more than 20 years. No one who lived in Washington was allowed to have a handgun in their home. If you had a long gun, it had to be kept disassembled and locked. And you were not allowed to take that gun from one room to another within your own home. That was bearing the arm. If someone broke in, you still could not put that gun together. And I was one of those who was able to get a seat for the Supreme Court argument on this. And at that point, one of the justices, I think it was Justice Robert, said to the Solicitor General who was arguing on behalf of the district, he said, "You mean that in the middle of the night when it's dark and someone breaks in, I have to somehow put a gun together, but you're not even going to allow me to do that?" And the Solicitor General kind of backed off. But that was the law. And the District of Columbia versus Heller actually overturned that as unconstitutional because it violated people's right to have a weapon in order to protect themselves and their own home, and also in that decision to protect yourself when you're going out. You have a right to keep and to bear a firearm. Since then, the number of guns in this country has really skyrocketed, and particularly during the Obama era. Whenever there was any effort to have more gun control, people went out and bought a gun. But the amazing thing about it is that this great increase in the number of firearms that people own has not resulted in a greater number of homicides, and in fact, quite the opposite. But what is on the screen, your map, talks about shall issue, and I just want to briefly go into that. I know it's a bit technical, but it's important. There are different, first of all, there were a lot of states that didn't allow anybody to carry a gun outside the house. And because of the Heller case, they all had to agree to it. However, they have different rules about whether you can actually have a right to actually carry a gun. There are some that are discretionary, and those are the ones that you see in that light tan. Those are the only ones left. Discretionary means that you have to persuade the police department that you have some need to carry a gun that day. If you live in a dangerous area, you have to walk through some dangerous area because of your work, that doesn't matter. It has to be just that time. There's been a case recently in Maryland, which is one of those states, and the Supreme Court didn't take it, and so the lower court upheld the idea that you only had a right to have a gun in your house, and it's still up to the police whether you can carry it outside of your home. I used to live in Massachusetts for many years, and in Massachusetts is one of the discretionary states. In Massachusetts, there were sheriffs that bragged that they never gave anybody a right, never. In a place like New York, the people who are important, who have a lot of money, they can do it. They can get a permit to carry, whereas people living in the poor part of town or who are worried cannot. So discretionary is truly discretionary and very subjective. Shall issue is different. If you have a shall issue state, that means that in that state, anyone who is a law-abiding person has a right to own a gun and goes through a particular procedure. Maybe you have to go through a course for a certain number of hours or something like that, but fulfill some standard requirement, must be issued a right to carry a gun. And in the last few years, you can see all those red states are shall issue. Thousands of people have gotten a right to carry a gun in those states. You can go from Florida to Washington State and never go through a state that is discretionary. The ones that are darker, sort of a dark maroon, and this isn't quite up to date, are states in which they have what they call constitutional carry. If you have a right to have a gun, you have a right to carry it. At the time that this map was completed, there were just a few. Vermont had had that rule for ages. I don't know if Sanders is going to try and change it. This state has been changing, but at any rate, Vermont had no gun regulations whatsoever. At any rate, there are now 13 states, so just in the last couple of years, more and more states have shifted to this constitutional carry. But I think it's interesting to see that map because you can see how few states still insist on this discretionary rule so that only certain people at certain times can get to carry a gun. I have a friend whose daughter was attacked and just barely escaped being raped, who lives in Maryland. And Maryland would not have allowed this young woman to carry anything really, any firearm to protect herself, and still doesn't. Let's see if I get this one right. This is the death rate, non-suicide, of gun deaths. And there, we hear a lot about mass killing and, the terrible atrocities. However, in the last years since the 90s, the murder rate from guns has gone down precipitously. It says that red line is California, and apparently when this map was done, it was because California was having this three-strike rule. 3 strikes and you're out, you go in jail, you're out of circulation. So I think they put a line there showing that had gone down. But basically, the firearm deaths have gone down precipitously. Now, I'd like to contrast what's going on in this country. Remember, we have all these people getting guns, being able to carry them for their own defense. And in Virginia, where I live, it's a shall issue state, and I certainly don't feel endangered walking about in it. Great Britain, which basically gave us this right. It was one of the rights of Englishmen at the time of the Revolution and the time the Bill of Rights was drafted, changed. They used to have a completely free right to have guns, and there were no rules and regulations basically limiting it. That didn't start until 1920 with this Firearms Act, and that was after World War I, and they were afraid of a Bolshevik revolution, and they had all these men coming back from World War I who were worried about their having been kind of embittered and disturbed by that awful war. So they passed this Firearms Act. Now, the idea of it was that you had to basically register to get a gun, and you had to go to the police, and they had to verify that you were a suitable person to have it and that you had a good reason to have the gun. And people in Parliament were assured there's no problem. But what happened was that all the police in Britain are under the Home Secretary, and the Home Secretary's office was sending out classified documents to the police departments defining what was a good reason to have a gun. And even at the very beginning, the good reason was you lived in some remote area. It kept ratcheting down what was a good reason to have a gun. And by 1969, it was never a good reason to have a gun for your self-defense. And even banks were not allowed to have anybody armed to protect the money within. And this was not known to the public. It had never been debated in the Parliament. But just that simple law had gotten more and more restrictive. The 1953 one is, in some ways, even more obnoxious, I think. In 1953, I guess they were worried about juvenile delinquents. At any rate, this Prevention of Crime Act ruled that you couldn't carry anything that was an offensive weapon in a public place. Now, what was an offensive weapon? Anything you might carry to actually protect yourself if attacked was automatically offensive. If you were carrying an umbrella with that notion that you would use it, that was having an offensive weapon. And of course, Parliament, objected. There was one of the members of Parliament who said that there's a woman who works for us, and every night she has to cross this lonely heath, and she has taken to carrying a knitting needle in her pocketbook. And one night, she was attacked by a young man, and she stabbed him with a knitting needle on a tender part of his body. Now, is she not going to be able to protect herself? And the government responded, well, she shouldn't have to do that. Society will protect her. Right? So now you cannot carry anything in Britain to protect yourself. No chemical sprays, nothing. But I'll elaborate on that a little bit further. But at any rate, in 1998, they confiscated handguns after there was this, atrocious mass murder of little children in Scotland. When they were debating that, and of course they knew where the handguns were because they were all registered. They say sometimes the NRA is paranoid about that. No, I mean, when they know where they are, they can get them back. There were two attempts to have an amendment to that rule. One would have allowed the British Olympic target shooting team to keep their guns to practice, but no, they have to go to Switzerland or France to practice. They've not been nearly as good ever since. And the Second Amendment was to allow handicapped shooters to have a gun because it was one of those sports where they could actually compete on an equal level. But no, it was zero tolerance. So all of these handguns, some of them, souvenirs from World War I or II or antique weapons, were confiscated from their owners and destroyed or sent to museums. It's interesting, though, that within 10 years, the number of crimes with handguns had actually doubled because all those people who had registered their handguns were not about to do anything illegal with them. So it really was not very effective. Now, what to do if you are a woman in Britain? There's a website which you can check on Google called Ask the Police. And the Ask the Police website, people wrote in and asked, well, when I'm out shopping or, walking, what legal device can I have to protect yourself? Actually, and the BBC had written that you could use your keys or a handbag or a briefcase. The only legal device, this is the police saying, the only legal defense product you can carry is a rape alarm. Now, I kept trying to think, what could you carry that you could use to protect yourself that wasn't offensive? And maybe a whistle or an alarm. So this makes a very loud noise. This is the only thing that's legal. Apparently, there was some possibility that a particular stain that you could squirt on the person might be legal, but as long as you didn't get it in his eyes and hurt him. If you hurt your attacker, in other words, maybe by some stroke of luck you get him down, you must not hit him again because then you are guilty of assault. You then must kind of run away. If you are attacked, people have been taught that they are not to intervene. The professionals will handle it. The police will handle it. And so the first thing people used to be told, according to the BBC, was call the police. So instead of calling help, which you would think would be your natural inclination, you're supposed to say, call the police. But now they don't even say that. Now you're supposed to yell fire because, believe it or not, more people will pay attention if you yell fire than help or call the police. They might think maybe there's danger to them. So that's what people are advised to do. It's sad because there are all of these people who are really afraid to go out. They're afraid, to go out in the dark. And I don't have time to go into it, but But they have nobody who's under 18 gets incarcerated, presumably unless they murdered somebody. So they get warned, and then they can come back and do things again until they get beyond 18, because they're called children under 18. So they're not really helping people much. And I don't know if any of you remember that in 2010 there were a lot of riots in London and other large cities in Britain. And there was arson and people being beaten up and people leaping from buildings to avoid being burned alive in the buildings, and the police did very little to stop it. Amazon had a 1,500% order from the UK for American baseball bats. And as I like to say, it's not they were taking up the game, you know. They just wanted something to protect themselves. It's really very sad. But they like to think that we're a cowboy country, and they are very civilized. At any rate, to conclude, we are really very fortunate to have this right to be armed for our self-defense. You don't have to be armed for your self-defense. The beauty of it is nobody knows who is. And in fact, in America, there are very, very few what they would call live burglaries, because burglars are more afraid of armed homeowners than they are of the police. Whereas in Britain, they're just as happy to have you home. In fact, they prefer it, because then your alarms are off. And if you harm the burglar, you can be in trouble. So sometimes burglars have sort of sat down with the person and said, look, you know, this is what I want. You know, just stay aside. Just one more story, because I don't want to go too long here, and I won't give you a chance to ask any questions. But there are a couple of these incidents that just make an American, you know, shake their heads. There was a man who had a plastic artificial gun, and it looked like a real gun. And two burglars came into his house, and he pulled this fake gun on them and held them while he called the police. When the police came, they arrested him for putting people in fear with a toy gun. I mean, so there's really very little people can do. We're fortunate that we have this right. It's enshrined in our Second Amendment. It's not easily changed, much to the distress of a lot of people who are out there working hard to see if they can't get rid of it or amend it into meaninglessness. But I should say that the District of Columbia versus Heller, that key case, was passed by 5-4. That was a 5-4 decision. And there are some justices who dissented, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who have called for it to be reversed. So all those people that are worried about Roe and other cases, here's one that could be reversed if, you know, if another judge got on there and changed their minds. So fortunately, you know, so far so good. We have this decision, and in a follow-up case for Chicago, McDonald versus City of Chicago, Chicago had virtually the same law as Washington did. The right of individuals to be armed was spread to the entire country. It had to be incorporated and go in order to be effective in the entire country. Washington, of course, has tried very hard to thwart this rule and came up with a very complicated way in which people could maybe get guns. And so there have been subsequent court cases about that. You can carry a gun in Washington, but what they did was that you can't carry it within 100 yards of every university, high school, middle school, nursery school, public or private, public park. There are so many. I thought if you had a map of Washington, you did circles around all those places, there would probably be no way you could get from here to there, you know, without violating that. But at any rate, it's sort of a continuing struggle, but so far we've managed to do it. And I think it's one that's extremely important for women, because all other things being said, the gun truly is an equalizer and can be used at a distance so that you can kind of protect yourself. Thank you very much. Yes,
Thank you so much, Joyce. What a great review of all that. Let me ask first.
Okay.
I remember when they confiscated the guns in England, and people handed them in. A lot of people. I can't ever conceive of that happening in America. Can you?
Actually, I can't either. I mean, I don't think that the police would want to go door to door asking for people's guns. We don't have a full registry, although when you buy a gun, you have to get this background check so that the FBI has this list. But I should say that there are two areas where they did try and confiscate guns. One was LA and one was in Connecticut. And I was going to say, you'd be happy to know, Americans being Americans, nobody handed them in.
Right, right. I mean, you wonder about the difference with the Brits. Maybe socialism makes them all.
Well, they think it's more civilized not to have them.
Right, with their teeth. Okay,
Right.
now if you'll raise your hand, we have a microphone here. If you'll give your name and affiliation. I saw a hand in the back there. I'll let you call on people.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, that was
Oh,
great.
oh, thank you.
Dunlop, and I work here. And I'd like to know, do you own a firearm? What kind do you own? Where do you practice?
Actually, it's in that article about me, that profile. I have an old shotgun, and it is missing a clip, so it's pretty useless. I'm not a gunny. It's for me, it's the principle of the thing. I don't really feel people should have to be victims. And so there was one point at which there were some muggings in my area, and I thought about it. If you have one, you have to be prepared to use it and trained. And so far, I haven't felt the need. But it's a good question. I feel a little ashamed. I'm not even very expert on the different calibers. Any other questions? Oh, okay.
I've been reading that women, oh, thank you. I've been reading that women in the inner cities, African American women in particular, have been purchasing many more guns, and that there is some data to support that there are fewer, problems because they are able to defend themselves. I don't have specifics, but I wonder if you would address that, because we have Black Lives Matter, except in Chicago in the South Side. And I find the hypocrisy is just astounding to me. And so if you have women who are trying to protect their families, and they're probably single moms, most of them,
Yes.
where is the support for these women to raise their children?
And instead you have these women marching, marching against guns, as if that would save lives. Actually, I should say that one of the women who was on the original Heller case as it went through was a Black woman who lived here in Washington and had been reporting drug sales on her corner and to the police, and these people knew where she lived, and they said they were going to come and get her. So, obviously she felt really worried. In Chicago, Otis McDonald, who was the main plaintiff in this case, was a Black man in his 70s, and he had been robbed several times. So there's a real need, and women are buying guns, and I had some statistic of, I guess it's the last 2 or 3 years, something like 77% more women are buying handguns for their own defense and carrying them. And it is a shame, because it's those cities and the inner cities where it's most needed. If you had discretionary laws, those people would never get them. But they claim, for instance, here in Washington, they claim, well, we would be fine if it weren't for Virginia, right? Virginia has, a right to carry, and so no problem. It's just that Virginia doesn't have that crime rate. If guns were the problem, then we would have the same kind of, of crime rate that they have here. So it's a shame. And one of the judges in the Heller case, Breyer, who was a dissenter, looking at the 20 years of the ban in Washington and noticing in his dissent that Washington, compared to 49 other cities, was worse after the 20 years than it was before the 20 years of the ban. But he said, people should be allowed to, that's why you saw that picture of me swinging my hand. People should be allowed to, the legislature should be allowed to do what they want. This is what they want to do, fine, even if it doesn't work. So, you sort of feel that the people that are so intent on depriving other people of guns have almost a sort of a religious belief that somehow that will be safer. But the government really cannot protect people, and it wouldn't be, I mean, to my mind, certainly wouldn't be safer to disarm people and just leave, everyone in the hands of the government and those people that pay no attention to the law.
Question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that, powerful statistics. I would love to get your slides afterwards. We can chat about that afterwards and see if we can make it available to you all. You mentioned that 4,000 women a year die at the hands of their abusers despite
Right.
the restraining orders. I think that's a powerful statistic. And then you mentioned that women gun owners, that number is increasing. I saw
Yes.
Mark Penn's new book, Microtrend Squared, has an entire chapter that he calls Annie Oakley's. The fastest growing segment of gun ownership is women. This cosmopolitan study that you mentioned showed that if you fight back, you're less likely to be injured.
Yes.
I would love to be able to get more about that, because I think often women won't cite a study, maybe on gun ownership if they think, whoever is doing the polling might be, more biased. But cosmopolitan shows you can defend yourself, you're more likely to survive. Mark Penn was Clinton's pollster. If we can look to, this is just evidence, it's just data. All of these kinds of studies I think are really helpful to us. If you could tell us a little bit more about this cosmopolitan.
Yeah, I hadn't actually known about it until I started to get into preparation for this talk. And apparently there was, it was a study of, I think, 1.2 million women, they claimed. It's very hard to get people to take a poll or survey and admit that they have used a gun to defend themselves, because they're really afraid that, some of these guns are not legal. There's a website about women who use guns to protect themselves. And one of the women who used a gun really carried one, and she worked in, I think, she had to cross into Maryland with that gun to go to work. So she never reported anything because it would have been illegal for her to be carrying it in Maryland. But, she had a walk along the river to get to work, and one morning there was this, bulky guy standing there with a knife, and it was only her having that gun and showing it that made him back off, and she didn't report it. And according to her, about a couple months later, there was a woman who was attacked and killed by this guy, and the police eventually got him. But, she was really able to protect herself. It's interesting that that Cosmopolitan had it, and actually there was on the web discussion about this, and on Google, there was someone saying, where did they find these numbers? Oh, blah, blah. I don't know. I thought that it was really interesting. There are victimization studies, and these are big surveys that just go out to everybody. Anything that is done by the government, people are not going to say if they think they'll be in trouble. And the police do not record self-defense issues. They don't keep any record of it. So it's very hard to get to that number. And there are supposedly maybe 2 million people who have used a gun in self-defense here in this country in a year. But the surveys are all over the place. The people who feel that guns are no use only want to count the times you actually used a gun to kill somebody. Most of the time, that isn't the case. Most of the time, you just need to show that you've got it to be, and that whoever wants to attack you will back off. So, it's a way of minimizing the numbers to just count people you've actually killed.
I didn't realize they didn't track the self-defense numbers.
Yes.
So I don't know a ton about the different types of guns, but I do uphold the Second Amendment from a constitutional viewpoint. However, whenever I bring this up to people, a lot of people I know that are more liberal, they tend to say, well, you don't need more than one gun, or you don't need that type of gun to defend yourself, and they have an issue with the type or how many you have. So how would you best respond to that by still saying that it is an individual right to have that many?
Yes, one of the expedients that they have done now recently, some states, is to try to limit the number of the size of a gun clip, so that you can only carry 7 bullets in a clip that holds 10. And the fact is that you might not actually aim all that well the first time. And that woman who saved herself by showing a gun to this potential rapist had a very cheap gun that she knew would misfire on the second shot. So she was only likely to get 1 shot off. People collect guns like they collect other things. A lot of people do target shooting and sport shooting and hunting. The slippery slope issue with these rules is the so-called assault weapon, because an assault weapon can be anything. It can be just so long as it looks scary. And we had 10 years of an assault weapon ban, and what made a rifle an assault weapon was if it had this little handle coming down, to brace it, and a scope. There were just sort of cosmetic features. And I think in California, I don't know whether they passed this, they had an assault weapon ban that would have basically included a lot of semi-automatic rifles that people use, that there are millions of, for hunting as assault weapons. So you have to be really careful what they're going to define that way. But I don't know that I've answered. I mean, there are some people that simply collect guns.
I'm sorry.
Okay. I was just going to say, people who've grown up with them tend not to worry about it. They just sort of take for granted that you have guns in the house, and they're much less likely to misuse a gun than someone who has not. They know how to, treat it respectfully. Yeah.
Have you had any discussions with civil libertarians about the whole gun registry issue and what that actually means to us as a country when we have this gun registry at the national level?
Yes, I should say I've had lots of conversations. This is such a pleasure not being pitted against somebody who is going to refute everything I say the best that they can. In some ways, this national background check is a kind of registry, because they know, who at least has applied to get a particular gun. They don't know how many you have, and part of the rule is that the records are to be destroyed. They're not supposed to keep these, although one never knows. But yeah, they feel, well, cars are registered. You have to get a license to have a car. Why shouldn't you have to get a license to have a gun? But cars are not guaranteed. They're not a constitutional right to have a car. This is something that's actually in our Constitution. So, yeah, they feel that it's just what they call sensible gun regulation. But the English example, to me, is a perfect example of why there is a serious worry about that. Because once they know where all the guns are, they can take them away. And of course, there have been a lot of examples of, Nazi Germany and other places where people were forcibly disarmed. And then they say, well, in case if there's a, violent takeover, what good would your little handgun do? But it can cause a whole lot more trouble to someone trying to, get rid of all your rights and take over. So that, I think that there's still, obviously people are going to feel that it's paranoid to not want to register, but there's living proof that that leads to some, confiscations.
Kentucky began to, on the very local level, pass right-to-work laws when the Kentucky legislature would not do that. And it was effective. Have you thought at all about the ability of communities in states like California and Maryland and New York to actually pass their own laws permitting citizens to own firearms and carry?
Well, there have been some local laws. I mean, one of the issues that I find concerning is that some of our appeals court judges will not uphold Heller. And there was a case, often these towns go the other way. Highland Park in Illinois, which banned all so-called assault weapons, including all of these very common guns used for hunting. And when that was appealed to the appellate court for Illinois, that area, the judges who had found no problem with the Chicago law, by the way, felt that, well, whatever Heller says, the important thing is that people should feel comfortable. And if it makes them feel more comfortable, fine. And the Supreme Court did not take that case. So if they don't take a case, these lower court rulings stand. I've been working on what to do about judges who really ignore the Supreme Court, you know, and there also are some towns that go the other way. I don't know how successful they would be in California as a difficult issue, although I do know there's been a recent case with Hawaii, which still falls in this Ninth Circuit, wasn't allowing people to have carry a gun outside of the home. And lo and behold, the judges on the Ninth Circuit actually reversed that. So sometimes those things happen.
You mentioned that if towns can okay guns, they can also okay to confiscate them.
Right.
So it's a kind of a double-edged sword. I'm wondering with the school shootings and whatnot, what's not really discussed much in the media or anyplace else is that it wasn't just the guns that caused damage. It was the fact that people were standing around, the guarders of the public
Right.
standing around, not doing anything. And I think that needs to be kind of addressed a little bit more directly. Probably not as many children. I mean, it's a guess, you know. But I think that there is more than just individuals having or not having firearms to protect themselves. If it is if the public is going to be protected, then the public ought to be protected, which means that the people who are trained to do it ought to do their job.
I was really distressed by that Florida shooting because not only did the police know that this man was a danger, they had visited his house, 39 times or something? How many? And they never reported him. They knew he was armed, and despite going to the house all those times, they never disarmed him. And then the police hid behind their cars while the shooting was going on. And I think that the media was happier to sort of dwell on these students who were protesting and guns, we should get rid of guns, and really didn't concentrate on the first responders who did not respond. You know, if you have people who are supposed to be protecting you and they're hiding while the shooting goes on until everything's quiet, you know, you can't depend on them. I thought it was really remiss of the media to not give that more attention. And I think that Florida has tried to do more, but you're right. I thought that was really terrible. I mean, the fact that the police knew about this guy. I mean, what would it take? How many times? One of the problems too is that, and it doesn't get a lot of mention, that back in the 70s, the rules for incarcerating someone in a mental facility who was at danger, committing them against their will, got changed. These facilities got dismantled, and there were supposed to be substituted community centers for them. But the community centers have never really materialized properly. There aren't that many beds for people. The ACLU felt that, you know, privacy rights trumped somebody who might be dangerous and need to be committed. So we really gotten into a situation where there are not enough facilities for people who are a danger to themselves and others. And that needs to be addressed. And I know Congress has had a couple of bills trying to do that. And there are families that are really distressed and have no place, you know, to put some child or a relative who is a danger and simply needs protection. Instead, they're loose with their meds, you know, and they take them or they don't take them. So, you know, that's I think, a more important issue for the nation to solve, and not, you know, so sexy and simple, but it needs to be done.
We call it deinstitutionalization
Yeah.
And, if I can ask one final question,
Okay.
forgive me.
No.
You know I love this book. Benedict Arnold, the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, the politics of the time were so rotten and dirty, as bad, if not worse, than what goes on now. Would you just share what inspired you to write this wonderful book about his life?
I thought he was an extraordinarily fascinating individual. I mean, the fact was that before he changed sides, he was a great hero. And as he, I have a quotation at the beginning of the book in which he says that, that the posterity will benefit from his accomplishments in this war. And we have. I mean, he was the decisive officer at Saratoga. The general in charge, Gates, really disliked him and confined Arnold to his tent. And Gates spent the whole of that battle in his tent where he couldn't even see the battlefield. And it was actually debating the merits of the revolution with a wounded British officer while the battle raged. And Arnold burst from his tent, got on a horse, and with no command whatsoever, led the victorious charge. I mean, he's extraordinarily interesting. And I thought, it's very easy to dismiss someone as greedy, self-serving, but that doesn't answer why someone who risked his life over and over, used his money to pay his own men when Congress didn't, would change sides. So I just thought he was, extraordinary and had done a lot of exciting things, which made it a long book to write because there was so much that he had done. And I hope that I have, sort of fleshed it out. But it does get you into the more sort of seamy side of what was going on. There was a shootout in Philadelphia between the radical patriots and the moderate patriots. And those are not things that end up in the history books. So thank you.
Congress so skeptical of the military men and all that. It's a great book. You have to read it. Well, we have a couple of gifts for you here to thank you so much for a wonderful talk. We have our Clare Booth Luce Policy Institute limited edition coffee mug with a famous saying.
No good deed goes unpunished. Said I can tell you that.
Little tote bag to put all your other gifts in.
Thank you very much.
And from Heritage Foundation, thank you for the really inspiring address today. Our Heritage Guide to the Constitution. I know that's what's inspired your work. And we really appreciate you joining us today, and invite you all to join us for lunch. We'll be back in the Shaw Conference Center where we can continue the conversation. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.